This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning. My name is Mark Scott. I'm Politico's Chief Tech Correspondent. And to those in the room, I congratulate you for staying the longest. Well done. And for those joining us online, both here in Europe and the US, welcome. Before we get going in this Digital Bridge discussion, we have some opening remarks from our presenting partner, Workday. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I am Jens-Henrik Jeppesen, and I represent Workday. We're a leading provider of enterprise cloud applications for finance and human resources. We're an American company. We have a growing presence in Europe, where we have more than 3,000 employees, and we serve more than 2,000 companies headquartered in Europe. And I'm pleased to introduce this Transatlantic Digital Bridge session. The transatlantic relationship cuts across all sectors of our societies. This partnership is essential for protecting and advancing the liberal democratic order. The technology issues that we deal with on both sides of the Atlantic are similar, and the values that we bring to these issues are similar as well. So there's a real scope for transatlantic leadership on a broad range of issues, and I'll just highlight two. One is international data transfers. This has been a tough issue on the transatlantic agenda for a long time, especially since the Schrems II ruling. So we were incredibly pleased to see Presidents von der Leyen and Biden announce the agreement in principle on a forthcoming transatlantic data privacy framework last month. And so were European and international industry groups from a broad range of sectors. Trusted data flows are key for business operations, innovation, and collaboration across sectors like healthcare, pharmaceuticals, manufacturing, hospitality, etc. Workday serves European companies in all these industries. These world-leading companies need to manage data effectively on a global scale. And they need access to the best possible cloud-based technology. And so do the many European SMEs and unicorns that are growing and scaling across Europe and globally. We look forward to the implementation of the agreement, and we hope for swift adoption of a new adequacy decision. The new EU-US framework can hopefully also help create broad alignment among partners in the OECD on international norms in this field, and it bodes well for transatlantic partnership across the policy agenda. And top of that policy agenda is artificial intelligence. Workday integrates AI technology across many applications. We believe in innovation that unlocks human potential and positively transforms how people and organizations operate. We believe that for AI-based technologies to deliver the full benefits for societies, they need to be trusted. And therefore, we advocate for risk-based and proportionate regulation that enables a vibrant market for trustworthy AI. Executive Vice President Vestager mentioned this point very clearly in this morning's interview. The EU AI Act is the first attempt at global regulation. We support the core elements of the proposal, in particular the focus on high-risk use cases and the use of risk management and self-assessment. These elements are vital to maintain as member states and Parliament review the proposal. On the US side, several initiatives are in progress. First is the work of the National Institute of Standards and Technology on an AI risk management framework. It's an important initiative that we have supported consistently and provided input to. We think the risk management framework can help enable interoperability between US and EU approaches on AI risk management. Further, just last week, the US Department of Commerce announced a new National Artificial Intelligence Advisory Committee. This is an important step in shaping the US administration's AI strategy going forward. The Department of Commerce statement about the Council states goals that resemble those of the EU, promoting innovation and competitiveness while mitigating risks and protecting citizens' rights and civil liberties. One of the 27 members that will serve on the committee in a personal capacity is Workday's Shayan Chakraborty, Executive Vice President for Product and Technology. He joins fellow AI experts from academia, industry, NGOs, civil society. As US policy evolves, we'd like to see an approach that reflects the AI Act's focus on self-assessment and risk management. In the short term, we look forward to hearing about the progress on AI and standards in the EU-US Trade and Technology Council. The TTC can and should be an important forum for dialogue and alignment. And as mentioned earlier, and as current events are demonstrating every day, a strong and durable EU-US partnership based on our shared values and commitments are essential to dealing with the many difficult global challenges that we're facing. That's it. I've scratched the surface. Over to Mark, Werner, and Peter for the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for that. A couple of admin things. I like to make this conversation as back and forward as possible. So if you have any questions, please put them on Swapcard or put them on Twitter at #PoliticoAI. With that out of the way, we have two of the policy experts with us, both from the US and Europe. And the reason why we frame this around Digital Bridge, the self-plug, is that I do a weekly newsletter looking at these transatlantic issues. So please sign up if you haven't already. Peter, I want to turn to you first. Since the Biden administration started back in January 2021, there has been this sort of, America's back, we want to build up relationships. And that obviously involves Biden coming to Europe in June. This is the Trade and Tech Council, and we can see this emblematic with what's happened, unfortunately, with the invasion of Ukraine recently. Just from a sort of how this is being sort of the reset, if you will, in the relationship, how much has Ukraine-centered minds in terms of greater cooperation between Washington and Brussels?
So very much appreciate the chance to speak with you today. And sorry I was not able to come over in person, and appreciate you letting me speak with you virtually. And it's a great question. I mean, I'll be very honest. I actually think it was the foundation that we had built over the past year through the TTC, through a variety of other, bilateral forums, both with the European Commission and with key member states, that gave us the foundation on which we have been able to successfully do so much cooperation on the Ukraine-Russia file. The TTC, we had a working group stood up on export controls. We have, over the last 3 months, done a historically unprecedented degree of cooperation between the EU and the US on export controls. In the TTC, we've set up a technology, a sort of digital technology working group. And when we thought we would get into that working group, we were thinking about, issues around algorithms and transparency. We have seen how much more important that is because of the Russian misinformation and all the issues we're seeing online. So I actually think that it is the TTC and the foundation we built last year are why we have been able to work in such a coordinated, such a focused, such an allied fashion, dealing with this threat to all of our security. And I think that the next TTC, obviously coming up in less than a month now in France, is going to be an opportunity to drive that cooperation even further.
Werner, I know TTC specifically is in your remit, but I'm going to put you on the spot as a representative for the Commission here. To Peter's point, it does feel like something's changed. As much as there was ongoing sort of bilateral discussions with the previous administration, since Biden has come in, there has been obviously a variety of meetings, both with, say, van der Leyen and Biden when they announced the Privacy Shield Agreement in principle, the TTC meetings both with Catherine Tai or Dombrovskis, as well as the working groups. It feels, I don't know, what is your sense from Brussels in terms of that rekindling, sort of the trust is back, if you will?
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Also with everything that Peter's just said. And my boss, the Executive Vice President Vestager, as you know, is driving this process very much together with Executive Vice President Dombrovskis. And I know from working with her on a daily basis how high that is up on her personal agenda as well. And you just mentioned, of course, the invasion in Ukraine. And as you said, even this morning, I think even the fact that people know one another and know whom to call, which sounds so obvious but may not be the case, was extremely instrumental already in the very short run. But not only is it important to talk, by talking to one another, we also find out how close we actually are. Because whenever I'm at events like this and often prompted sort of, EU versus US, and what are the problems that you're having with one another, or where may you disagree? I mean, I would argue that the list of points on which we agree as really like-minded continents and nations, if you want, it's just so long. And if you talk to one another, that becomes so apparent. And I think that is one of the outcomes of the last year of all these talks in the working groups. Of course, we may have differences of view here and there, but the list of items where we think, well, actually, we see the same issues and we have the same mental, approach behind that. Yeah. That's so important to acknowledge.
So I'm going to scratch half of my interview questions if you guys agree on everything and everything's fine. So that doesn't make my life any easier. Can we just maybe unpack a little bit on, let's start with the agreement, because it's easier to get to, right? We've had the Privacy Shield 2.0, whatever it's called, in principle. There's discussions around AI, both at the TTC as well as within the OECD. There's movement, at least on enforcement, when it comes to some of the competition cases. Peter, for you, if you had to pick a top three of where you see a lot of cooperation with Europe and the US, where would you focus? Semiconductors? I mean, what's the greatest hits, if you will, of cooperation?
I mean, I do think that semiconductors, but as an example of supply chain, sort of cooperation on supply chains. Look, we are in a world today where supply chains are changing. Companies want and governments want more resilience in their supply chains. They want more diversity in their supply chains. They don't want to be, entirely dependent on a competitor or adversary nation for key inputs. And so I do think in this world where supply chains are rerouting, and that is not something that happens overnight, that is something that happens over months and years, there is a lot of cooperation between the US and Europe. So semiconductors, one, absolutely. But, cooperation on critical minerals for the green transition and for other reasons. And, access to minerals, the Russia-Ukraine conflict only brings home the importance of that even more. Cooperation on food security issues. Russia, Ukraine, again, bringing that home even more. Collectively provided about 25% of the world's wheat. Ukraine, that is all being destroyed by the Russians and can't be exported because of the Russian war in Ukraine. So we have to cooperate on global food supply chains. I think supply chains, of which semiconductors are a piece, but when we think about it, it's also broader, more critical set of issues. I think in terms of writing standards for the next generation of technology, and to the point, we definitely are going to have disagreements on, aspects of AI regulation, on aspects of data privacy, but I think we have a very strong view on both sides of the Atlantic that we are united much more than we are divided. And that if we want to write the global standards, whether for AI, data privacy, these kind of things, we have to overcome our comparatively small differences, get those standards set, through the TTC, and then take them out globally. So I think the standards setting on kind of emerging and digital technologies is a key piece of work. I think the export control cooperation, now that's something we can't just do between the US and Europe. You got to bring in the other key players, Japan, South Korea, Canadians, for certain technologies. Other parts of the world too, but clearly a ton of opportunity for cooperation there as well. Obviously, a lot of other areas that we are working together on, whether it's kind of investment related areas, whether it's for fostering the SME economy online, these kind of things. But I think those three are three key areas where I really think we'll be driving the agenda over the coming months.
Werner, to your point about there's more that binds us than breaks us apart, I fully agree. But there are some here in Brussels who would suggest Europe's third way, if the US and China are to, is to go provide a regulatory rule book for the West. You looked at GDPR, the impact of Schrems 2 and the Privacy Shield 2.0. You look what's happened with the Digital Markets Act, what may happen tomorrow depending on what happens with the Digital Services Act, the AI Act coming maybe in the fall. As much as there is cooperation, the fact that Europe is pushing ahead and to a degree is exporting this rule book, or if not exporting it, suggesting others should follow, how much, I have to, I'm the cynical journalist, how much is that creating some friction, do you think, in terms of we all agree, but there is a different regulatory approach, there is a different legislative approach, and they are not on the same speed at the moment?
No, and I was not suggesting that we cuddle every day and that we agree on everything at every minute of the day. My starting point would be that in substance, in a way, on all of the things that you mentioned, we would increasingly actually align. We've been discussing Trustworthy Ai long before, on an international scale, long before we came with our proposal. We've been discussing disinformation and the adverse impacts of platforms long before we tabled the DSA. The difference probably is indeed more the regulatory approach to it, that while probably in America traditionally you would start by softer ways of doing this and relying on industry to sort it out, markets to sort it out, we would probably have a more assertive way, to put it in positive terms, of taking these challenges on and say, okay, if we want to shape our digital world, that will not happen just by asking companies to do the right thing. If we have sort of experience that this may not be happening all the time because interests may not be aligned. So Europe has this sort of this political will and also ability, I think, to come with legislative responses. Yeah? And this may not always be the first reflex on the other side of the Atlantic. But yet, when I was in Texas with my boss just 3 weeks ago, Southwest, she was talking to an American audience. Yeah? And she said, guys, actually, you should have invented the DSA and the DMA, because that is the instrument that these are instruments that put the individual at the center, the rights of the individual, the rights also of a small company or any company, a startup, to get a fair chance of surviving in those markets. So, and then she got a full round of applause when she explained it that way. So again, I think we may have different approaches, but we actually want the same thing pretty much, I think.
So first of all, Peter, we know that Werner may not give you a hug next time you see him, so just don't take offense to that. The second point is, why didn't the US do the DSA DMA? If it is, though there is, if you look at the Pew research, there is growing wariness of access to data, dominant markets. There are multiple bills in Congress right now trying to deal with some of this, and the White House, has also stepped into this void, if you will, into its own proposals through either via executive order or the Declaration of Independent Internet Freedoms in I think next week. But why? This is where I fall into the cliche. Why hasn't Washington been able to move on this stuff when there seems to be public anger on what's happened the last, say, 10 years?
I do think you see growing momentum and interest here in Washington and moving on a number of these issues. If you look at this administration on, say, competition policy, right? We have appointed some of the toughest competition policy and antitrust regulators, I think, in history, certainly in many decades in this administration. I think you're beginning to see that in the enforcement approach they are taking. That's not just focused on the tech industry, of course. That's kind of across the board. We're taking a tough approach on competition policy. As you alluded to, I think we are seeing bills develop in Congress on both competition policy issues and also on kind of content moderation. How do we deal with some of the harmful activities online? The reality is, in our system, we do need our Congress to enact a number of these proposals, and they are debating them, and I can't sort of speak for what our Congress will do, but I do think you're seeing growing momentum, and certainly here from the executive branch perspective, you're seeing the Federal Trade Commission both on competition policy, but also looking at how we can, within the authorities we do have, do more to, improve privacy online, do more to, address harmful content. We just have a different system. We're more reliant on Congress, but I do think you're seeing that momentum for reform building here in Washington as well.
If I ask Werner to be sort of the representative for the Commission, it's only fair to ask you maybe to be the White House whisperer for us. I mean, is there a level of frustration that Congress hasn't been able to move some of these bills forward? Particularly, we've got the midterms, coming at us pretty quickly.
Oh, look, I mean, I'm not going to speak for, all the details of what's going on in Congress. I'd have to, but what I would say is I think we have been clear that we certainly think it is important to address these challenges we're seeing. That's why we've appointed the folks we've appointed on the enforcement front. That's why I think you are seeing us with President Biden signed a competition executive order last year, and you've seen our President's Competition Council gear up. So I think we are sort of firing on all cylinders on this with the authorities we have, and are in discussions with our congressional colleagues about what they may be able to move.
Mm. Sometimes when I feel there's a binary discussion about, I think you referenced it in terms of Europe does X, the US does Y, and I think it's a little bit too simplistic, but we are at the stage now in Europe where the rule book was almost finished. If you look at December 2020 to where we are now, DMA done-ish, DSA may be done tomorrow, depending on how the final discussions go. As much as I could understand each region or country is going to work at its own pace, it would be quite helpful, though, wouldn't it, to have the US pass or take on board some of the things going on in Europe, either be it the voluntary code of disinformation, be it some of the gatekeeping principles of the DMA. There's a variety of things that Europe is doing. Wouldn't it be useful for the US to follow suit?
First of all, we are not there yet. Yeah, of course,
Sure.
we've been quite fast, I must say, in getting these things through the machinery, and I'm very positive about tomorrow's trilogue, that we get the DSA over the line as well. But I mean, we're still then talking about months of implementation and so on and so forth. But the second thing is, we don't necessarily need now a mirror legislation on the other side of the Atlantic to do this, to do the same thing. What we do actually, and also discuss in the TTC context, is leaving aside whether something is now legally binding or not, how you could actually do these things in practice. Yeah? Take AI as an example. In the AI working group in the TTC context, we are looking sort of into the principles of trustworthy AI and how you could actually measure that and do that, right? Now, the principles as such, as I said at the beginning, are already pretty much aligned anyway, have always been, right, in OECD and in G7 and where have you. So we all know what actually trustworthy AI should look like. Now, if we work together on both sides of the Atlantic on how can we develop tools that allows us actually to do that, then the question of whether it is a legal requirement in a given context or whether it's done on a voluntary basis in another jurisdiction is almost secondary in nature.
Peter, as someone who's been involved within the TTC growth, if that's the way to put it, we have 3 weeks to go. I'm not sure if you're coming to Paris or not, but can you give us an update on where things stand? I hear export controls is something that will be discussed. Semiconductor supply chains is also in there. I heard something about potentially sort of voluntary guidelines on disinformation may also make it into the text. I mean, where do we stand on the TTC?
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward. I am going to be coming to Paris to join our leadership. Obviously, Ambassador Tai and Secretary Raimondo and Secretary Blinken coming over as our co-chairs from the American side. But I will be joining the delegation. Very much looking forward. Very much looking forward to it. Look, I think that the text and the deliverables, if you will, are coming along very nicely. Obviously, we are holding this TTC against the backdrop of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the impacts that is having on, all of our economies. And so I think you are going to see us focus on, you're going to see a focus on how can we build on the cooperation we have had to respond with our economic and trade and technology tools to the challenges we're facing from that. But we are also very much going to be moving along, the longer term agenda, supply chain cooperation, export controls, as you say, carrying forward the principles on AI, the responsible use of AI that we began to develop back in September, carrying that forward. I think you'll see some principles on, how we should think about algorithms and transparency in the digital media space. I think you'll also see us take some steps to cooperate, in a work we're doing together to deal with non-market economies. Obviously, also an issue we started working on in September, but something that we are quite keen, as are our colleagues in Brussels, to help drive forward. So I think you're going to see a very robust agenda, a very robust set of discussions, and a good set of, as we put them in government, deliverables coming out of this.
To bigger non-market countries is China?
Look, obviously, I think one of the challenges we face collectively is the economic challenge we face from China and the technology challenge we face from China. One of the reasons it's so important we set the standards on emerging technologies together as like-minded democracies is China is offering an alternative, right, that is more surveillance focused, that is less secure for communications networks, for example, and the like. And we are in an era of geopolitical and economic competition. And as I think the Russia-Ukraine war illustrates, in an era of geopolitics, we have to be working together very closely to set the standards globally, to align our economies internationally, and to make sure that we're driving the agenda. So yes, absolutely.
Without looking to repeat, does that chime? It feels a focus on Ukraine is going to be part of the TTC discussion, mostly because, unfortunately, it is a global event that has taken over and consumed everyone's lives at the moment.
Not only because of that, which is of course obvious, but also because even in particular on the digital files, it has shown so many relevant issues, right? You referred to disinformation and the code of practice and to what extent we work with Americans and so on. Even within Europe and with the platforms, in the redefining in a way the code of practice against disinformation, that was sort of pushed back a little bit because we learned so many new things during that crisis. So it's not only that the crisis in itself keeps us busy and prevents us from doing other things, but partially it's the learning process, including on digital issues and on disinformation and how those things work in practice, that you need to onboard this to digest it, and that will then, it may delay some deliverables at some stage, yeah, but at the same time it may enrich our knowledge base when doing so.
Peter, I know that the pesky First Amendment sometimes gets in the way of misinformation, but is there any way that you would see either the White House take on some of the voluntary guidelines outlined in terms of how the platforms respond to disinformation, particularly foreign interference and the RT Sputniks of this world?
Well, look, I think we would, from an administration perspective, never view the First Amendment as pesky. We are, strong supporters and believers in the First Amendment. But I think you're correct that because of our legal structures, we obviously, want to work cooperatively with the platforms. We do face some limits in terms of what we can do regulatorily. I do think that platforms, and I think Europe has also had a bunch of discussion of the platforms. The platforms have been taking a number of steps, obviously, to get Russian disinformation off their systems. Some of that legally required in Europe, a lot of it voluntarily. They've been adjusting algorithms, and I think it is incumbent on us to keep pressing them to do more. But I do think the platforms have been taking a number of valuable steps here, and certainly the Russia-Ukraine war makes clear the importance of addressing this misinformation, disinformation ecosystem more fulsomely, which is one of the things we're obviously talking about in the TTC.
I'm going to give the final question to Nick Reyners, who asked, I think, a legitimate question in terms of, you've both discussed, maybe to Werner, international standards working together in cooperation. What does that actually mean in practice? Are we talking working within, say, the WTO, working in probably the ITU? I mean, what does greater transatlantic cooperation look like in terms of creating standards?
Well, I'm probably not the expert on standardization to ask this question to, so I would not even know all the structures behind.
Sure.
So it's more sort of the general idea that if we agree on principles of whatever that is now, for instance, Trustworthy Ai, and if we are able to pull off standards in order to get there, or if you're talking about data sharing, for part of our Data Act, for instance, how can we improve data sharing in a public interest or for research or for delivering new products, you may need interoperability more than ever before, and one instrument of doing so is standards. Now, so the objective of having standards is clearly a key objective. Who does what and when, in what forum, and so on, that would be beyond my knowledge.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to thank Peter and Werner for joining us, and to those online and in the room. Stay tuned. We have the closing interview with Ivan Bartoš, who's the Deputy Prime Minister for Digitization and the Minister for Regional Development from the Czech Republic, who has the Czech presidency coming up here in the EU. Thank you so much.